Today we're going to talk about vaccines and vaccination. Now, what is a vaccine? A vaccine contains a weakened, inactivated, or even parts of a pathogen. Now, once these components are introduced into our body, the vaccine stimulates an immune response, helping our body to build immunity. So basically, the vaccine contains an antigen, which is a molecule from the disease-causing organism. Our body sees this as a foreign and makes antibodies and memory cells. So if we're exposed to the real disease later, our immune system remembers and responds quickly and effectively, preventing illness or reducing severity. Now, there are very many different types of vaccines, but one popular type is live attenuated vaccines. Now, these vaccines are vaccines that contain a weakened, or other words, attenuated form of a live virus or bacterium that causes a disease. So these microbes are alive, but they've been modified so that they cannot cause serious illness in healthy people. Yet, they will still stimulate a strong and long-lasting immune response. These vaccines are commonly used to vaccinate against MMR as well as chickenpox. We then also get inactivated vaccines that are used with polio as well as hepatitis A. Now, these vaccines contain killed or inactivated viruses or bacteria. This means that the pathogen can no longer replicate or cause disease, but it still triggers an immune response because it still has antigens on the cell wall, cell membrane, or even protein capsule. Then we get subunit vaccines. Now, subunit vaccines contain only a small piece of the virus, either an antigen or a toxin or just part of the viral pathogen. Now, an example of a disease that is vaccinated with a subunit vaccine is the hepatitis B vaccine. Here they use the hepatitis B surface antigen as the vaccine and not the whole virus. So this fragment will be enough to stimulate an immune response without causing any disease. Another big one is toxoid vaccines. Now, they are made using inactivated toxins that are produced by bacteria. So they don't actually use the bacteria themselves. Now, we know that some bacteria cause illness not by infecting tissues, but by releasing harmful toxins. So these vaccines train our immune system to recognize and neutralize the toxin and preventing the disease. One good example of a disease that is vaccinated against with this method is tetanus. Now, the way they do this is actually very interesting. As an example, they'll take the tetanus toxin from the bacteria and then treat it with a chemical like formalin to make it harmless. So this then creates a toxoid. This toxoid is then injected into the body as a vaccine. So what we need to remember is firstly that vaccinations cannot cause illness. This is because an inactive or dead pathogen is used, or only a part of the pathogen. Vaccination will also provoke an immune response by providing the immune system with an antigen to respond to. Vaccination also protects against specific disease because a specific antigen is injected into the body, which means that the immune system will only produce memory cells and antibodies against that specific antigen. And overall, vaccinations boost the body's defense against disease. So how does it work? So firstly, you're injected with the vaccine. This vaccine contains antigens that are specific for the pathogen that causes the disease. Inside of your bloodstream, you have lymphocytes. These lymphocytes will recognize that the antigen does not belong to the body, that it's foreign. It will then produce antibodies that are specific to the pathogen or the antigen. It will also create memory cells that will have receptor proteins specific to the pathogen as well, which means that if you get infected with the pathogen in the future, your body is able to recognize the antigen quicker and produce antibodies and more lymphocytes specific to the antigen quicker. This reduces the time that the pathogen has to replicate. This is not always the case with all diseases because pathogens, especially viruses, can mutate very quickly. And once it mutates and the antigen that the body is used to changes, the body will not be able to recognize it and the pathogen can still cause disease. This is why we get flu every year. Even if you've had flu before or get the vaccine against flu, the chances that you will get flu is still high. One good reason to get vaccinated is to achieve herd immunity. Now, herd immunity is a form of indirect protection from infectious disease. This happens when a large enough proportion of a population becomes immune to a disease. This can be either through vaccination or previous infection, but this makes it difficult for the disease to spread. Let's use an example. Let's say you live in a household with someone else. You are not vaccinated, neither is the person living with you. You decide one day that you're going to go to the park. At the park, there's a person that's infected with a disease. When you are unvaccinated and you come into contact with this person, you will acquire the disease with its pathogens. When you go back home, because you do not have any immunity, it means that you will be passing on this disease to the people living with you. But let's say that you are vaccinated. Same thing happens. You go to the park. But now, because you're vaccinated, the pathogen does not get enough time to replicate within your cells. So when you get home, your body's immune system already eradicated the pathogen, meaning that you cannot pass on the disease to the person living with you. So when most people are immune, there are fewer people the disease can infect. This means even those who cannot be vaccinated, like newborns, elderly, or people with weakened immune systems, are protected because the disease can't spread easily. Kind of like a fire break in a forest. If enough trees don't burn, the fire, or in this case the disease, can't spread. Now, vaccinations has been one of the most successful public health interventions in history. Let's look at some examples to show just how impactful vaccines have been in saving lives and eradicating or controlling disease. Now, the first example that we're going to look at is the eradication of smallpox. Now, the vaccine for smallpox was introduced in the late 1700s and was widespread in use in the 20th century. Now, this resulted in the complete eradication in the 1980s. This is the only human disease ever eradicated by vaccination. Now, smallpox used to kill 3 out of every 10 people infected and left survivors either scarred or blind, which means now that it's eradicated, we do not even need vaccination for it. The virus only exists in laboratories. Now, by looking at the graph, we can see that between 1920 and just before 1980, there was still smallpox incidences. We can see between 1940 and 1960, there was a high incidence of smallpox, but it steeply decreased. By 1980, we can see that there was no more reporting of the smallpox disease at all. And that kept constant up to today, meaning that it's entirely eradicated. Next, we have polio. Now, the vaccine for polio was introduced in the 1950s, and cases of polio dropped over 99% worldwide. The polio once paralyzed hundreds and thousands of children each year. Now, polio remains endemic in only a few countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, and global eradication is within reach. So if we look at the graph of polio cases against polio vaccinations from the year 1981 until 2015, we can see that as vaccinations increased, the incidence of polio decreased dramatically. And here by the end of 2011 to 2015, there was barely any polio cases at all. This shows that there's a direct relationship between vaccination and immunity. Then there's also measles. So the vaccine for measles was introduced in 1963. So in countries with high vaccination rates, measles have been eliminated or drastically reduced. Before the vaccines, millions got measles annually, with thousands of deaths. Now, measles deaths worldwide dropped by over 70% from 2000 to 2018, all thanks to vaccination. So if we look at this graph of the reported measles cases between 1950 and 2020 in the United States, we can see that between 1950 and just before 1970, there was still quite a few cases of measles, between 300 and 800 cases per year. But when the vaccine got licensed just after 1960, the amount of measles cases dropped drastically. Just after 1980, we can see that it looks like it's been eradicated, but just before 1990, it started increasing again. This is when the United States suggested that people get a second vaccine for measles. We can see just after that in the United States, measles was eradicated completely. Next, we have hepatitis B. So the vaccine was introduced in the 1980s. In countries with routine infant vaccination, the infection rate dropped by more than 90%. So this prevented liver cancer and chronic liver disease later in life. Now, hepatitis B is part of a routine childhood immunization scheduled in many countries. If we look at this graph, it shows hepatitis B vaccination coverage rates and the prevalence of HBV infection in children under 5 years. So we can see as hepatitis B birth dose and third dose vaccinations increase, the prevalence of hepatitis B decreases. This again shows how vaccination reduces infections. Lastly, we'll have a look at HPV. Now, HPV is a virus that can cause cervical cancer. The vaccine for HPV was introduced in the mid-2000s. Now, this resulted in a major reduction in HPV infections, genital warts, and precancerous cervical lesions. HPV is the leading cause of cervical cancer. Now, in countries like Australia, they are on track to eliminate cervical cancer as a public health problem within decades. Now, this graph here shows the prevalence of genital HPV infection. It also shows how much of the population has the vaccine. So they show this as men and women. Now, HPV does not really show any symptoms in men, but it does cause cervical cancer in women. This is why I think more women are vaccinated than men. Here we can see that 32% of women are vaccinated, whereas only 11% of men are vaccinated. We can also see by the graph that more men have genital HPV, whereas less women have genital HPV. 45% of overall men has it, where only 27% of women have it. We can also see that in women, most women that have HPV is between the ages of 20 and 25 years old, whereas most men that have HPV is between the ages of 56 and 60 years old. This graph shows that HPV vaccination still has a long road to go before being eradicated as a disease. So before we end the video, let's look at this infographic that shows the number of lives that were saved by childhood vaccinations since the 1974s. So measles is a whopping 94 million lives. Then it goes down all the way to polio, which is still 1.6 million lives that has been saved. Yellow fever is at 550,000, and on this infographic, the lowest is meningitis A, with 2,000 lives that have been saved by vaccination.